So today we'll be in Galatians chapter 3 as we continue this series of Let's Say Grace and following in the journal. And if you don't have a journal, I encourage you to pick up one of the journals in the very back. But today we're going to take a look at Galatians chapter 3. And last week we looked at the beginning of Paul's letter in Galatians chapter 1 and Galatians chapter 2. This is an interesting letter, and it's not like any other of Paul's writings, because this is a letter that Paul is writing to one of his churches that he serves as an apostle over, and he began this church, and Paul is writing to this church, and you can tell by his letter that he is really, really upset, and he really gets to the core of who we are as followers of Christ. And so this is a very important letter for us, even today, that we need to remember. But the issue that actually came up, where there were some, Paul says, are Judaizers, and these Judaizers came into the church. They were followers of Jesus Christ, but they were spreading a message that really was not the message of Jesus Christ. And what Paul is doing is he is addressing this church, and he is saying, you have to get back to the message of the gospel that I preached to you. And he's doing it in a scholastic way. He's really being a scholar in writing this, and we'll see some of that here in Galatians chapter 3. He's doing it as an apostle, and he's calling them out, saying, you have left the true gospel, but he is ultimately doing it out of his love for the grace that Jesus Christ came to give to each and every one of us. And so these Judaizers are saying, you need not only the grace of Jesus, but you need to add to the grace of Jesus. And so what you have to do if you really want to be a follower of Christ, you take his grace and you take the law, and then you put those two together, and then you're going to be okay. But what Paul is saying is, we are justified. We are made right by faith alone and absolutely nothing else. The works of the law, the works of tradition, none of that has any weight when it comes to how you are justified by your faith. And so what these Judaizers have done to the Galatian church is that they have said, we have to go back to that covenant that was made with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And we've got to go all the way back to that covenant, and then we've got to help this covenant be fulfilled. And so these Galatians, or these Judaizers, are in essence preaching a wrong gospel to the Galatian church. If we were to go back and take a look at the covenant that God actually made with Abraham, in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, the very, very end of that verse, it's recorded this covenant that God actually made with Abraham. And at the end of this, God says to Abraham, and all people on earth will be blessed through you. And Paul is, here in chapter 3 of Galatians, Paul is reminding the Galatian church about that covenant. These Judaizers are falsely using this covenant with Abraham to bring the people of followers of Jesus back to the law. And Paul says, okay, let's use that covenant with Abraham as the foundation of our faith. And what is happening here in this, Paul is saying? Paul says that Abraham was justified by his faith. Because if you remember what actually happened here, the law didn't come for a long, long time after this covenant here in Genesis chapter 12. And Paul says, you can't jump to the law. You've got to stick with exactly what Abraham did. And so here is a little bit of an illustration, the best that I could give you this illustration of what actually this message these Judaizers are preaching. They're saying that the law doesn't stop. That even though the cross is right here in the middle, and we would say over here on the left is the Old Testament time, and over here on the right is the New Testament time, where the cross is dividing, the law just keeps on going. It doesn't stop. And so what we see after the cross, these Judaizers are saying, you need grace that came on the cross, and you need the law. But they are forgetting exactly what Jesus taught. Jesus taught that on the cross, everything changed. Everything about our relationship with God changed. And you see, Jesus defeated the consequences of sin. And he also took the penalty of sin away, the effects of the result of sin. He conquered death. He conquered sin. He took care of it all. And so these Judaizers are saying, you not only need grace, you also need the law. When the truth of the matter is, this is how we should be living. The law led us to the cross. But on the cross, it all changed. And after the cross, the only way that you are able to be in relationship with Jesus Christ, and I want you to hear this, after the cross, the time that we're living in now, the only way that you are able to be in relationship with Jesus is because of God's grace. Nothing can bring you into relationship with Jesus. And nothing except your own rejection of God's grace can take you out of relationship with Jesus. Doesn't matter how much somebody wants to steal you away. Doesn't matter how much somebody tells you the truth or the wrong. None of that matters. It is by grace alone that you are in relationship with Jesus. Because if we don't accept that, and if we don't believe that, then the cross was in vain. If we say it's grace plus something, then what we are saying is, well, Jesus, we don't really need your cross. We just need to help out in some way or in some measure. Let's go back to the way that it used to be. And that's exactly what these Judaizers are doing to the Galatian church, is they are saying, you need to help God out. Oh, sure, Abraham was justified by his faith. Abraham was blessed so that through him the rest of the world could be blessed. But Abraham needed to help God out in some way. And if you remember, what happened to Abraham? Abraham got in trouble when he tried to help God out. You remember what happened? He thought, well, if the world is going to be blessed through me, if it's going to be my seed that comes out of me that's going to help the world out, then I've got to speed this up because the wife that I have and I sure aren't able to do this. And so let's try to help God out in some way. And that's when Abraham got in trouble, when he acted on his own. In the same way today, in the church today, when we get in trouble is when we try to help God's grace out. And that's what was going on here in Galatians chapter, in the entire book of Galatians. I want you to write this down. The only thing that determines if you are a part of the church is if you follow Jesus, not the rules that you follow. The only thing that determines if you are a part of the church is if you follow Jesus and not the rules that you follow. Now, here in a church that's of the Wesley Arminian tradition that we would say is a holiness church, this is something that could maybe get us excommunicated. But I believe that in our tradition, we have relied too much on what we do to try to earn God's grace. We have taught that it is God's grace that justifies us, and then we help God out in all of these other areas. And we think that all of these other areas in our life that we would say leads to holiness is what then justifies us in right relationship with God. And you see, that's exactly what Paul was preaching against writing against in Galatians chapter 3. The only thing that determines if you are a part of the church is if you follow Jesus, nothing else. And that's why I love being a part of the church of God. Because we don't even hold a membership, because we know that our feelings against anybody else matters nothing on if you are a part of the church or not. It is only God that can make you a part of the church, and your reliance upon His grace. And Paul is saying, this is how we have to act. It's God's grace alone. So let's look at Galatians chapter 3. And I want to start reading here. We're not going to read the entire chapter. It's a short chapter. It only has 25 verses. But you can read that on your own. But I just want to start here at the very, very beginning so we can dissect the proof that Paul is sharing here. In verse 1, you foolish Galatians. You see how upset Paul is here? we were to take a look at what we read last week, you remember what he said? He took lines that my grandmother actually borrowed from Paul when he said, now mark my words. And here he just really pours it on and he said, you foolish Galatians. I want to back up. I think that this just hit me, and I just want to share this. I'm not saying that holiness is wrong. I want to make that clear. You could have mistook what I was saying about holiness. But holiness doesn't save us. Holiness is the effect of what God did for us. Holiness is what stirs up inside of us that says, I need to be more like Jesus. Holiness is what spurs us on to become the people that God created us to be. But it is not what puts us in the church or what puts us out of the church. And when we have separated ourselves sometimes from some of the people who aren't what we would say is holiness, we have erred. That's what I'm saying. And what we should do is pour the love of God over these people to bring them closer and closer to God. That's what Jesus did when he was with the woman at the well. He was saying to somebody that he should never have been around. He was saying, if you experience the love of God, he was letting his holiness wash over her and bring her closer to relationship with God. So what I'm saying is we have to be careful when we take the holiness that God demands of us and try to require that of other people. Holiness is between you and God. And where you are at may not be where somebody else is at. And we can't say because we're here and they're here that they are not in relationship with Jesus Christ. Because it is only the grace of God that makes you a part of the church, not the law. That's what Paul's teaching here. So now let's go back. That's a sermonette, if you will, in a sermon, so you can get a get out of sermon free card. No, that's not right. Galatians chapter 3. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by observing the law or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning with the Spirit, are you now trying to attain your goal by human effort? Have you suffered so much for nothing? If it really was for nothing, does God give you His Spirit and work miracles among you because you observe the law or because you believe what you heard? Do you see what Paul is really writing here? He says so clearly, are you so foolish? Are you so foolish to think that God gave you His Spirit because you were observing the law? Are you so foolish to believe what the Judaizers are teaching to you? So what we can glean from this, what we can gather from what Paul is writing to the Galatian church, is the Spirit was at work among them. So we see that they are followers of Jesus Christ. And they have come so far in their relationship that they have experienced a second work of grace, which is the receiving of the Holy Spirit. Paul says in verse 3 here, he says, are you so foolish after beginning with the Spirit? Are you now trying to attain your goal by human effort? And then in verse 4 he says, or verse 5, does God give you His Spirit and work miracles among you because you observe the law or because you believed what you heard? You see, Paul is just saying, the gift that you have, the gift of grace and the gift of God's Spirit is simply because of God's grace and nothing else. It's not that you're earning it. It's not that you have done something to receive God's grace or to receive the Spirit. It is simply by your faith. We are justified by faith, Paul wrote. The reason that Martin Luther stood when he was quoting the Scripture and he walked down the steps and eventually posted his 95 Theses on the Church of the Door is because one of the reasons that he stood was because he understood in that moment that he was justified. He was saved by his faith alone and the free gift that God had given him. And so that's where we have to operate in the church. That's where we have to let God's grace overflow out of us onto other people. Continue reading with me in verse 7 if you would. Following along in verse 7. Understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham. Now do you see the scholarly tie that Paul is really putting in this one verse? He is saying that if you have faith, you're a child of Abraham. Going back to that covenant that God established with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. He's saying that just as Abraham was justified by faith, you then too are justified by faith. Don't you understand that? Paul says, verse 8, Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. Isn't that interesting? And we don't think of what Abraham went through in those terms. Paul said, God announced the gospel to Abraham. Well, what was that? That was the blessing. That through Abraham, all people on the earth, all people, everyone, absolutely everyone would be able to receive the blessing of God's grace. Well, what was the seed? It was leading up to Jesus Christ. So when we say that the entire Scripture is God's love story leading up to the gift that He gave you, it goes all the way back to the very, very beginning. Because in Genesis chapter 3, God knew that He had a problem that nobody could fix except Himself. And Paul is writing here that the law led to the grace on the cross. Verse number 9. So those who rely on faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, as it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. Clearly, no one who relies on the law is justified before God, because the righteous will live by faith. Verse 12, the law is not based on faith. On the contrary, it says the person who does these things will live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Jesus Christ, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. So here's how this played out. In Genesis chapter 12, Abraham received a blessing. He received the blessing from God that all people on the earth would be blessed through him. It wasn't until chapter 17. From chapter 12 to chapter 17. 12 was the blessing. Chapter 17 was the rite of circumcision. And now these Judaizers are coming to the Galatian church and they were saying, listen, this is what you have to do in order to receive the grace of Jesus Christ. You've got to go back and you've got to make sure that this has been played out. And what Paul is saying is there's a separation between the blessing which led to the gospel and in chapter 17, the rite of circumcision. And note, the law wasn't given until about 500 to 600 years after this took place. And Paul is distinguishing. They understood what Paul was writing about. And he was distinguishing through these two things. In verse 7, when he said, those who have faith are children of Abraham, he was crushing the teaching of these Judaizers. And just in the same way that Paul was crushing this false teaching in the church here in Galatia, we have to do the exact same thing with any false teachings that are around us that teach that we need to do something in order to earn the grace of God so that we can be a part of the church. All you need to do is by faith receive that free gift that God gave to you. You see, this is not the message that Paul was teaching. It's not the grace plus law. It is simply the grace of Jesus Christ. Because Paul understood that grace is God's power operating inside of us. And it is by grace that we use our own power and our own strength. And then Paul said, only because of God's grace, and only because you are justified by faith in God's grace, will you receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. And what we see in God's grace operating in us, we are then filled with the Holy Spirit's power to overcome any darkness that the enemy might attempt to bring into our own life. Paul is saying here, it is grace that sets us free from trying to earn God's favor. It is grace that empowers us when everyone says it's grace plus something. It's only God's grace. I want to skip down to the end of this chapter. So take a look at verse 26 if you would. You can read here in the middle of this about the law and the promises. Paul begins in verse 15 by saying, I want to give you an example from everyday life. You can dive into that. But I want to skip here to the very, very, very end of this because it is so powerful and something that we need to remember to crush false teachings of legalism that abounds in the church in America today. In verse 26, so in Christ Jesus, Paul says, you are all children of God through faith. And look at verse 27 and 28. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. Listen, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free. There's neither male and female, for you all are one in Christ Jesus. All of us are one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. What Paul is saying is, the message of the law divides us. Oh my goodness, how this is the message that the United States of America needs today. And we're holding it here in the church. It's the grace of God that unites us and brings us together. And the further that we get away from God's grace, there's division, and it separates us. But what Paul is saying is, listen, it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or if you're a Greek. It doesn't matter if you're a Gentile. It doesn't matter if you're a male or a female, if you're a slave or if you're free. It's the grace of God that brings us together. And we, church, have the answer that the world needs to unite us and make us stronger. Oh, how it's been times of crisis in our country, that we have come back to God's grace to be united and stand strong. And then as time goes by, and if we march through the years and we march through the decades, we separate ourselves further and further from God's grace. But then a crisis comes and we come right back to God's grace. Sometimes I just wish a crisis would happen so that we can go back to God's grace, and then I pray that we would stay there. But because we can't wish that upon ourselves, we have to be people of grace. And Paul is calling us, through his letter to the Galatian church, to be people of grace. Not Jew and not Gentile. Not slave and not free. Not male and not female. Not anything that would divide us. But only people of grace. The grace of God that unites us and brings us together and then sends us forth marching in the same direction under the banner of God's grace alone. It's in God's grace. It's only in God's grace that we are one, where we belong. God's grace is what saves us. It's by faith that we are then justified, and faith in that grace alone. I want to close this morning by sharing a short story with you. It's actually written by, his name is Timothy Paul Jones, and he wrote a book about God's grace. It's called Proof, Finding Freedom Throughout the Intoxicating Joy of Irresistible Grace. And it's just too good of a story not to share with you this morning. In his book, Timothy Paul Jones shares about how they adopted a middle daughter. And they brought her into their already established family. But as they learned about this little girl, they discovered that she was previously in an adoptive family. And for whatever reason, that adoption didn't work out. And so here this little girl went through the rejection again of having to be put back up for adoption, and through that long process of finding another family. And Timothy Paul Jones shares that they adopted her. And this is what he says. For whatever one reason or another, whenever our daughter's previous family vacationed at Disney World, they took their biological children with them, but they left their adopted daughter with a family friend. Usually, at least in the child's mind, this happened because she had done something wrong that precluded her presence on the trip. And so by the time we adopted our daughter, she had seen many pictures of Disney World, and she had heard all about the rides, the characters, and the parades, But when it came time to passing through the gates of the magic kingdom, she had always been the one in that family that was left on the outside. Once I found out about this story, I made plans and said we are doing whatever it cost to take our family to Disney World. I thought I had mastered the Disney World drill, he says. What I didn't expect was that the prospect of visiting this dream world would produce a stream of downright devilish behavior in our newest daughter. In the month leading up to our trip to the Magic Kingdom, she stole food when a simple request would have gained her a snack. She lied when it would have been easier to just tell the truth. She whispered insults that were carefully crafted to hurt her older sister as deeply as possible. And as the days on the calendar moved closer to the trip, her mutinies simply multiplied. A couple of days before our family trip to Florida, I pulled her daughter onto my lap and I talked through her latest escapade. I said, I know what you're going to do, she said. You're not going to take me to Disney World, are you? The thought actually hadn't crossed my mind, but her downward spiral suddenly started to make sense to me. She knew she couldn't earn her way into the Magic Kingdom, so she tried and failed that just as she had failed that test several times before. She was living in a way that placed her as far as possible from the most magical place on earth. In retrospect, he says, I'm embarrassed to admit that in that moment, I was tempted to turn her fear into my own advantage. The easiest response would have been, if you don't start behaving better, you're right, we're not going to take you to the Magic Kingdom. But I didn't. Instead, I asked her, is this trip something that we're going to do as a family? She nodded. Her brown eyes were wide and rimmed with tears. Are you a part of this family? She nodded yes again. Then you're going with us. Sure, there might be some consequences to your behavior, but you're a part of this family, and we're not leaving you behind. I'd like to say that her behaviors grew better after that moment, but they didn't. Her choices pretty much spiraled out of control at every hotel and rest stop all along the way. Still, we were headed to Disney World as a family, and on the day that we promised, it was a typical Disney day. In our hotel room that evening, though, a very different child emerged. She was exhausted and a little weepy at times, but her month-long mask of rebellion had faded away. When bedtime rolled around, I prayed with her, I held her, and I asked, so how was your first day at Disney World? She closed her eyes, snuggled down into her stuffed unicorn, and after a few moments, she opened her eyes, and this is what she said. Daddy, I finally got to go to Disney World, but it wasn't because I was good. It was because I belonged to you. It wasn't because I was good. It was because I belong to you. You are in a relationship with God, not because you're good, but because you belong to Him. It's because you belong to Him. And let me tell you something. There is nothing between heaven and hell that can stop Him from pursuing you with His love. And sometimes we just need to stop and rest in the grace of Jesus Christ. Paul is saying, in writing to the Galatian church, just stop it. It's not because you're good. It's not because you've done anything. It's because you belong to Him. This morning as we close our service, I just want to invite you to rest in God's grace. Again, it's not because you're good, it's because you belong to Him. I want you to rest in the words that God has declared over you. That He could have chosen anyone in this world as His child, but He chose you. Rest in the unfaltering love of a Father that chose you. You know, sometimes we let the enemy beat ourselves up, and we let the enemy say to us that we're just not good little Christians. We're just not good enough to God. We just need to do a little bit more. We just need to add all of this stuff to try to get into a right relationship with God. But those are simply lies from the enemy. And until we rest in a God's arms that says, it's not because you're good, it's because you belong to me, we will always go through the decade-old attempts of trying to earn the love of God. So as we stand and as we sing in just a moment, I want you to picture in your mind God as if he was here today. He is here today through his Holy Spirit. And although we can't see him, we know that the promise he's given to us, he's gathered here with us today. And I just want you to picture this God that loves you unconditionally. There's nothing you can do to stop him from loving you. He always is pursuing you, and he's always chasing you. I want you to picture this God with that type of love and that type of grace that he wants to give to you. I want you to picture this morning that God just speaking those words over you. It's not because you're good. It's because you're mine. It's because you're mine.